Hello, you are listening to the Charles Bonnet Syndrome podcast. My name is Shaimond, and today's special guest is Richie Kahn. He is a public health professional by training, clinical researcher by trade, and patient advocate by necessity. While working in ophthalmology back in 2019, he was diagnosed with a rare and orphaned form of optic atrophy. More recently, Richie was diagnosed with Charles Bonnet Syndrome. As co-founder of Canary Advisors, Richie is intensely passionate about better incorporating the patient perspective into the clinical development process and, of course, raising awareness about Charles Bonnet Syndrome. So how you doing today, Richie?
I am doing well, Shaimond. Thanks again for the opportunity to chat. I hope you're doing well too.
Yes, I'm doing well. Thanks again for joining us. I look forward to what you're going to say. I'm sure it's going to be an interesting conversation. So to start out, can you tell me a little bit more about yourself? Then we can talk about your eye condition and Charles Bonnet Syndrome.
Yeah, absolutely. And probably no surprise, it's all connected. So I come from a family of nurses. I used to volunteer in the back of an ambulance myself. And I learned pretty early on that even though I was quite passionate about healthcare and medicine, a career practicing with patients one-to-one wasn't really what I was looking for. When I discovered public health and health policy, I got really excited because I saw the opportunity to impact multiple patient lives at once. So that's what I decided to pursue. I started working for a nonprofit that serves the community impacted by hepatitis B. And one thing led to another. I wound up falling into clinical research back in 2010 now, so almost 15 years ago. And what drew me to public health is what drew me to drug and device development. So the opportunity to impact multiple patient lives at once. I have worked across the industry for any number of different companies, kinds of organizations, but my focus has always really been on reducing the inefficiencies in drug development. So if you're waiting for a new treatment, if you have a condition that doesn't have a treatment, I want to get you to that potentially life-altering new possibility sooner, right? And I was doing that work for a company that does nothing but ophthalmology, so developing new drugs and devices for the eye. When I had a routine eye exam, which wound up being anything but routine, I was originally diagnosed with a clear-cut, albeit early onset case of glaucoma. And I was working in business development, really in sales at the time. I was also a public health guy, as I mentioned. So I had a couple different hats on, and I decided to start researching glaucoma and opportunities to volunteer to get involved. I was fortunate in that I discovered the Glaucoma Research Foundation very quickly. They are really the foremost organization working to connect the patient community and the clinical community as well, and to really build awareness of some of the things that can help patients become more empowered, better informed about glaucoma, so they can preserve their vision or slow vision loss. And my volunteer work began, I think, in March of 2019, right after my initial diagnosis. The end of the year, I was at a meeting the Glaucoma Research Foundation was putting on, and I started chatting with really one of the foremost glaucoma docs in the country. And if you can't tell from my accent, I'm a Philly guy. He's a Philly guy. We started talking about the Philadelphia Eagles. And he said, I'd like you to come to my clinic. I want to see you myself. My wife and I are living down in North Carolina. We've been down here since 2011, but we still have friends and family in Philly. We were really excited to go back there and hang out a little bit. So I printed my paper copies of my medical records. I went into the doctor's office. The doctor looked at my records. He looked at me. He looked at the records. He looked at me. And he said, all right, two things. Number one, you've lost between 15 and 20% of your vision in about 8 months. And I don't think you have glaucoma. So I remember looking at my wife, and we were both very surprised because we thought I was a pretty typical patient. My eye pressure, which is the key indicator for glaucoma, was normal. I was taking my drops as I was told. Everything seemed to be pretty stable, but we learned very quickly that wasn't the case. So I spent the next couple weeks getting worked up to see if I had a brain tumor, if I had maybe experienced a series of strokes, because my optic nerves connecting the eyes to the brain didn't look right to the doctor. They looked very pale. But every single test came back normal. So we were a little unsure where to go, what to do. And the doctor said, the good news is I'm on the 8th floor of this eye hospital in Philadelphia. There is a neuro-ophthalmology group on 11. Go up there. They will take a closer look at the nerves connecting the eyes to the brain. And I remember sitting there. I think I was by myself for that appointment. It was about 4 hours long. And I remember at the end of the appointment, the doctor was audibly frustrated. In fact, the door to the exam room was open. He was in the hallway talking to some of the residents and fellows. I was sitting in a chair in the dark, and I saw this doctor throw his arms up in frustration, and he said, I don't know what we should do. Swab his cheek. Let's do some genetic testing. And 2.5 months went by. Didn't really think about the genetic test kit. It's now around Valentine's Day, 2020. And it's whatever that Friday is. I get a phone call and they tell me they're calling from the doctor's office, from the neuro-ophthalmologist. My genetic test results have come in. The doctor would like to speak with me on Monday at noon. I'm trying to not think about it too much because, number one, there's no information I'm going to glean over the weekend, so it doesn't make sense to be stressed out. But number two, I am very much aware that this is a doctor who stares at images of nerves all day, doesn't necessarily have the best bedside manner, isn't necessarily trying to suggest that anything's wrong. And I confirmed the appointment. I forget about it for the weekend. Quite honestly, I'm getting ready for a work trip that Tuesday. Had to go down to Orlando for a work conference, and it wasn't something I could cancel even if I needed to. But Monday rolls around and phone rings, and it is maybe 30, 35 seconds. I wouldn't even call this a conversation. The doctor confirms that he's speaking with me, and he confirms my genetic test results have come in. He tells me I have something called Wolfram syndrome and to consult a geneticist. I can hear the doctor's on a landline. He has physically pulled the receiver away from his head. He's getting ready to hang up. And I can tell the doctor is very nervous. He is very uncomfortable. And he's probably feeling that way because he is giving me a diagnosis that he knows nothing about. This is a condition that might impact 1 out of 700,000 people. I know he's also very uncomfortable because he probably did what I did, which was Google it, right? I don't even know that people really use the Merck manual for medical information anymore. But what the doctor told me was I have this very rare condition that doesn't have a treatment. It usually presents with vision loss in childhood between 6 and 8. Typically 2 years later, patients become insulin-dependent diabetics, and about 2/3 are dead by 30. And the reason for that, the condition progresses like ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, where the brainstem, which controls breathing, atrophies, and you were very much aware of what's going on, and you were aware that you were no longer able to breathe on your own. So at the time of diagnosis, I guess I was about 33, 34. I had not had the typical course or presentation. My vision loss didn't start till my 30s. And I'm not diabetic. I am not pre-diabetic. And I think maybe most disconcertingly for this doctor, I also wasn't dead. So he was telling me that I had really overstayed my lifespan by a couple years at that point. So I had a bit of a decision point really between the original diagnosis of glaucoma and the diagnosis of Wolfram syndrome. With the vision loss progressing, and I'll tie this into the Charles Bonnet in a moment, I knew that life traveling 70, 80% of the time was going to get a lot more challenging. In addition to the vision loss, I really have a lot of trouble with visual processing. So my brain takes in information through the eyes. And as a result of Charles Bonnet, I can't necessarily trust what I'm seeing. So it felt like spending a bunch of time in the airport was going to be really challenging. And I had the opportunity to figure out, what do I want to do from here? In the US, I think it's about 70% of folks who are moderately to severely visually impaired. And at this point, a couple years later, I'm definitely in at least the moderately impaired bucket. They're not able to hold down a full-time job. I am fortunate in that with my background and my experience in clinical research, There are a number of things I can do even without my vision, but I'm very fortunate, I'm very privileged in that regard. I know how much time and money and effort goes into creating new treatments for Charles Bonnet or other conditions. And I know that one of the biggest bottlenecks, I think, is a fundamental misalignment between what patients actually want and need and the way therapies are being developed. So I said, wouldn't it be cool if I'm able to focus on that disconnect? I didn't really know what it is or what it was called, but I came to learn it's something called patient-focused drug development. And I have been able to make that pivot and spend the last 5 years or so really focusing on making sure that the patient perspective is incorporated when we're developing new therapies for patients and communities that need a treatment, either something better than what's out there or a treatment for a condition that hasn't had one historically. Despite the Charles Bonnet, which I know we'll get into in a little bit, despite the moderate to severe vision impairment, I've been able to blaze my own trail in that regard. And I find that the vision loss and the Charles Bonnet in particular really help, I think, lend some additional credibility when I'm talking to patients, whether they're dealing with vision loss or other indications or conditions that are perhaps a little more rare, because there are over 11,000 rare diseases. There are 60 or 61 diagnosed, being discovered rather every week. And even though they're all so different, we have a lot of things in common. And I'm able to translate that across indications and therapeutic areas. So it's been really rewarding. And as odd as it might sound, despite the challenges I've had, I really wouldn't change a thing, right? Because there have been so many fantastic opportunities that have come my way as a result of the vision loss in Charles Bonnet. And I've just been able to make a fantastic group of friends, colleagues, and it's been really fantastic as a whole.
What a story. Wow. So many questions are coming to my mind. I don't know if you would know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask anyway. So you did the genetic testing and then the doctor said that you had Wolfram syndrome. So did the doctor say that you actually had like a gene that shows that you could be prone to having it or something? Like, I'm wondering how, since you didn't have any of the other criteria, no diabetes, you were living past 30, did he give you any insight into how he came up with that conclusion?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not like he was a particular savvy doctor. The genetic testing came back. It showed a mutation in the WFS1 gene, which is a hallmark of that condition. It can only, to my knowledge, really mean one thing. So it was pretty easy. When the test results came back, it was interpreted for him. He just had to share the information with me.
So at what point did you find out that you actually had optic atrophy?
So optic atrophy is strange. I mentioned that I was working in ophthalmology at the time. I thought I understood if you're losing your vision from glaucoma, you lose the side vision, the peripheral vision. If you have age-related macular degeneration or an inherited retinal disease like a Stargardt's, you tend to lose the central vision. If you have that inherited retinal disease, might start with night blindness where you really have challenges at night first. I really didn't understand that glaucoma is a blanket term for a bucket of about 200 or 300 different forms of optic atrophy. So all optic atrophy really is damage to those nerves connecting the eyes and the brain. Typically with glaucoma, the damage is caused because there's a buildup of fluid, which results in increased pressure on those nerves. And that pressure really leads to death in the field of vision, right? So that's why you wind up with damage to the periphery, or you might have those blind spots, for lack of a better term, in your field of vision. But I started to learn pretty quickly that optic atrophy is a lot more broad than glaucoma alone.
That's amazing. It actually reminds me of dementia, how that's like the main term. And then underneath that, you have Lewy body dementia and Alzheimer's, the most common form. And it's really, I've learned so much already. And we're just starting with the interview because you were saying there's something like 11,000 like diseases that are rare diseases or something along those lines.
Yeah.
And there's more being discovered every day.
Yeah, it's incredible. I've worked in oncology, endocrinology. So I've done cancer, I've done diabetes, I've done lupus. Over the years, I've really worked across the board, but in the last few years, I've begun to focus on these rare conditions. And it has been such an interesting experience, right? So often I'm learning about something just like you are for the first time, and I'm starting to really dig in, whether we're talking a type of dementia or a really rare form of vision loss I've never heard about. And it's really fascinating. And the best part is I don't have to be up on these as a clinician. I didn't go that route, but I can spend a lot of time learning about the clinical manifestations. But what I'm really more interested in is getting a clearer sense from the patients and the caregivers and care partners. What are the unmet needs? What are the quality of life impacts? And what are the preferences if a treatment is being developed for one of these conditions, either for the first time or to maybe replace existing treatments that aren't getting the job done?
And it's so important that it's a group effort. Like, I would just think initially that you have to be a doctor to be able to make any kind of progress, but you can be an advocate, you can be a drug developer, you can be some other kind of clinician or something. So there's so many different things that can be done to help with these trials or to help fight some of these conditions and to get some kind of insight and relief into some of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was so interesting because when I learned about clinical research back in 2009, 2010, I'll be honest, I had no idea what I was reading. I never heard of it. Like I said, I was working for a nonprofit and I was finishing my degree in public health. I was getting really anxious because I knew I'd have student loans coming due. And I had started dating someone that summer who was also working in public health. I thought that we might get really serious, and turns out we did. We've been married since 2010. But I started to feel like those two public health paychecks wouldn't pay for those student loans. It wouldn't pay off the debt. And when my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, was traveling home to visit family, I just sat down one night. I got some pizza, I got some drinks, and I opened my computer and I tried to find other ways to apply my skill set. And I started reading about something called clinical research. And it was absolutely fascinating. It was really intimidating. I understood each of the words individually. But when I was putting some of these terms together, it was like learning a new language. But that's one of the things that's kept me so interested and so motivated and so committed to the field since 2010 at this point, right? There's just so much to learn. And when you feel like you've got a good handle, things change, things progress, and it's back to the drawing board. So you're always building on that knowledge. You're not necessarily starting from scratch, but it always keeps on your toes, which is something I was really looking for.
That's incredible. So when did you first start having symptoms of Charles Bonnet? And can you explain what that was like and what kind of symptoms you had?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So I remember my two first visuals very vividly. And I guess I should say they probably weren't my first, but they were the ones that really stood out and the ones that maybe I verbalized for the first time. So one of them, my wife and I were standing in the kitchen. It was about 11 a.m. And I know it was about 11 a.m. because she was having a snack. She has a snack at the same time every day. We both work from home. And when she has that snack, she lets our dogs out into the yard. She'd just done that. And I don't remember for the life of me what she was saying. She is a brilliant woman, very witty and incisive. But as we were talking, I'm probably 8 feet away from her. And it's not that anything changed visibly. It's just she was now wearing Groucho Marx glasses and nose putty. And my wife is a prankster, but I knew this wasn't possible. I knew she hadn't left the room. And I made it maybe 10, 15 seconds. I started grinning and I said, "Hey, I apologize. I can't focus. This is what I'm seeing." And she looked at me like, I'm not really sure what to do with this information. This was probably late summer 2020. I know around Thanksgiving or maybe early December that year, we were in the mountains of Western North Carolina. And we had just bought a place out there. My wife had been out there the week before. I actually just stopped driving because I noticed some little things that made me uncomfortable with my vision. But my wife recommended I go for a run on this particular trail. I say trail, it's fully paved. It's a road, but it's called Buchanan Loop Trail in Webster, North Carolina. And it's pretty much right in back of our house. So I went over there, I went for a run, and I was taking in the beautiful mountain scenery. I had not spent a lot of time that far west, really in the Appalachians, but I was struck by not only the mountains and beautiful greenery, but there were all of these sort of Daniel Boone pioneer style fences. I don't know how many times I've related this story, but I'm embarrassed. I've never actually looked to see what that kind of fence is called. But the ones where the wood is just leaning together, there's nothing really acting as mortar or holding the wood together. But I'm looking at this historical fence and there is a marker on it. It's about 18 inches wide. It is ovular, it's horizontal. The outside is ringed in chestnut. The inside is baby food, gray, brown, and chiseled in. I don't remember the name, but let's just say it says Foy and it says like 1869, which I think is maybe the year that the town was founded. And I just took it in and went, that's cool. Finished my run. I was coming back to do a second loop and my wife was walking our dog, Gloria, and she said, "What do you think?" And I immediately thanked her for the recommendation. I loved the run. It's absolutely beautiful. And I told her about the fence and the historical marker, and she didn't really think about it, but she just said, "Cool, can you show me?" So I did. We stopped in front of that fence and we were there for maybe 5 minutes. We could not find the historical marker. We had no idea what was going on. My wife eventually shrugged and went, maybe it fell down, because what else could have happened? And we spent the next 2 weeks or so out there. I went by that fence another 8 or 10 times. There was no marker, at least not there. So what I was starting to learn was with my Charles Bonnet, I have a number of the, bucket one, shall we say, type symptoms where I'll see like repeated flashing lights or colors or shapes. Like when you shut your eyes, if you're really exhausted, you might see that. But I have a lot more of that sort of category 2 stuff where I will see things that are not necessarily there. Sometimes my brain will say, look, you saw one of these historical markers in Center City, Philadelphia in 2006. It should be there on that fence post. Other times it will tell me it just makes sense that your wife is wearing Groucho Marx glasses and nose putty. I know I mentioned to you when we were first talking, I can't drive a car anymore because I can't reliably read traffic. My brain will tell me a 4-way intersection is clear when maybe it isn't, or it will tell me there are 2 cars at that intersection when there aren't any cars. I might accurately see a car, but my brain might tell me it's a tan 97 Honda Civic with front end damage and it's a bright red new Camaro. I have no way of knowing. One of the ways I can tell when I'm seeing something that's not really there is if I'm going for a walk with my wife, and usually our dog Gloria is there, and I'll just start grinning ear to ear, and my wife will look at me and she'll follow my gaze and she'll go, "What does the dog look like?" And there's not a dog there. Gloria, our dog, is there, but I am seeing a dog that doesn't exist. Fortunately, I love dogs. I have never been surprised with the visual of a dog that's, say, chasing me. I don't have any of those really disconcerting manifestations, but I know a lot of people with Charles Bonnet really see things that are a lot more sinister, disturbing, right? They might see disembodied heads. I know people who see dragons. I see a lot of dogs where dogs don't exist. I have a terrible time with depth perception. I might not see a curb. A lot of the times steps will look like a ramp. The other thing that's been really interesting, and I don't know what's happening, right? Unless my wife starts quizzing me and then we can figure it out. I might see someone and my brain tells me they look one way. And in actuality, my brain is completely wrong. So we used to see a guy every single morning when we were walking our dogs. And one day my wife said, "What does he look like? What's he wearing?" And very convincingly, I knew what I saw, and I also knew that I couldn't trust it. But I described this guy to my wife, and I think I said, heavyset Caucasian guy, maybe 5'10". He's got messy hair and stubble, and he's wearing I think it was maybe like a black windbreaker and tan pants and tennis shoes. And my wife tried to not laugh. We both laugh about it because laughter is one of the ways we both cope with my vision loss. And my wife said, okay, number one, this guy is clean shaven. He has a bald head. He's probably 5'9". He's not heavy set. He's skinny. He's wearing a blue and white Duke University windbreaker, and he's wearing khaki shorts. He wears that every single day. We see him every single day. And I had no idea. So it's just been really interesting, not only with the vision loss, but with the visual processing issues and not necessarily being able to trust what I see and not always knowing when the information my brain is sharing with me or my eyes are sharing with me isn't accurate.
I like the fact that you said you and your wife actually laugh at the situation or you laugh at your vision loss. It's a serious condition, but sometimes you can't take yourself too seriously. You have to just find some kind of humor. You may not be laughing at the condition, but you may be laughing at the fact that you thought the guy was heavyset and he wasn't, or whatever the case may be, because I think that's so important because laughter is really like a medicine.
Oh, absolutely. Humor is a big way I cope with this. I spend a lot of time talking to other patients, educating doctors about Charles Bonnet. I can't tell you how many times I have spoken with someone. Maybe they are newly diagnosed with vision loss. Maybe they've been diagnosed for years. And no one has ever told me that they are seeing things, they're experiencing something, they've learned to be Charles Bonnet. But I tell everyone I talk to about what I've experienced. I talk about my experience diagnosing myself, bringing it to my doctor's attention, getting a pretty lousy reception from the doctor, and just telling some of those stories, whether it's Groucho Marx or dogs that don't exist. And I can't tell you how many times, it's probably 80%, I can either audibly hear relief in someone's voice, or if I'm able to see them, whether in person or on Zoom, when I can actually see the shoulders relax. They haven't told me that they're dealing with Charles Bonnet, but I'm getting the impression that we know the stats. I guess it could be a third or maybe 40% of people, no matter what their source of vision loss is, if they've had good eyesight and now they don't, if they've lost a lot of vision quickly, there's a good chance they're dealing with Charles Bonnet. Their manifestations might be different, but it's not a condition that is often discussed in the clinic. Doctors, nurses, care providers tend to learn about this in school and then they forget about it, right? And the end result is patients don't know what's going on. They are concerned they're experiencing a mental health crisis. They're dealing with Alzheimer's, dementia, and they're afraid to speak up. And it's just such a shame that they are dealing with this unnecessary anxiety, depression, frustration by themselves, because this is a very real condition. It has nothing to do with any sort of mental health crisis or episode. And there are things that a lot of people can do to either reduce the number of these visual manifestations they see or just help turn them off, for lack of a better word. But it all starts with that conversation. So I just try to do whatever I can to increase the likelihood that there is a discussion.
Advocacy is so important because sometimes you just don't know what you don't know. And a lot of times when people have Charles Bonnet syndrome and even other conditions, they may feel a little bit isolated or a little bit scared to talk about it, because if you just say, hey, there's a gorilla in my living room or there is two aliens walking in my backyard every night, somebody may think negatively of you. I really like the fact that the way that your wife is responding, because when you said she had putty on her nose and some other things going on, she was kind of like, well, I don't know what to do with that. Or when you said that there was a historical marker on the fence, but there wasn't, she said, maybe it fell off. And
Yeah.
she could have easily argued and she could have said, what are you saying? There you go again. Or are you okay or something? But I think the way that she seemed to have stayed calm and to be able to address it in that type of way was like supportive. So if there's any caregivers that are listening, I think it's so important to take notice of that, because it's often not what you say, it's how you say it. And somehow, some way, try to find a supportive way, to a patient way to address it.
Yeah, absolutely. I am very fortunate. My wife has been wonderful. She takes a lot of cues from me. So even the day I got that phone call when they told me I had Wolfram syndrome, I took a look at the paperwork, the genetic test results. I had a conversation with the doctor I knew and trusted. I confirmed that these test results are pretty much infallible. They're almost 100% correct. But when I told my wife what was going on, I was very calm. To this day, she was still, I think, freaked out by how calm I was. But I am someone who has spent 20 some years now on and off going to Buddhist temples. I am pretty well covered head to toe in Tibetan Buddhist imagery, lots of tattoos in that regard. And I'm very comfortable with all things being temporary, everything being impermanent. So the way I looked at it, I said, look, I could see pretty decently before. That's changing. It's going to change a lot more in the future. As far as the genetic test results, they are what they are. There's nothing I can do about it. Yeah, it's frustrating that there's not a treatment for Wolfram, but there isn't a treatment yet. And there aren't possible treatments without clinical trials. And I already work in that industry. But I didn't really see an option where I could afford to get really anxious and depressed and upset and frustrated and just take a step back from life and everything I was doing. I mentioned I had that work trip, unfortunately, the next day. I couldn't cancel. Got on the plane. I took my meetings. I did what I had to do. But before I flew down to Orlando, I did a little research and I found one of the doctors, there are only really a handful who do work in Wolfram syndrome. And this gentleman had just moved from Japan to St. Louis, Washington University of St. Louis, Dr. Fumi Urano. And I found Fumi's address and I sent him an email and he responded immediately. And he said, let's talk later this week. Me, you, your wife, my research nurse, any questions you have, I'll address. And he gave us a lot of information. He gave us a lot of things to think about. He also explained, and I don't really have a good way to satisfyingly explain this one, but he pretty much said, based on your genetic test results, based on the symptoms you are experiencing, you have, for lack of a better term, a mild version of Wolfram. I laughed and I said, well, what does that mean? My brainstem's only going to turn to jelly a little bit. I'll just like choke in my sleep a little because I can't breathe. What are we talking about? And he said, look, I can't guarantee you anything. Nothing's guaranteed, but you should not have to worry about the Lou Gehrig's type symptoms with the brainstem turning into jelly. And, you know, knock on wood, so far he's been right. I've had vision loss and a couple of other, they're not minor when they're happening to you, right? But symptoms that are far less egregious than what could have happened with the brainstem. So I just said, look, you've got to keep it moving. You've got to keep moving forward. Wife and dogs don't want to hang out with a sad sack on the couch all day. And maybe there's an opportunity here to make a difference in the lives of other people, right? Whether they have Wolfram or they've got Charles Bonnet, just it helped me recommit and double down to the work I'm doing. And just even when I have a really frustrating day or a week or a month at work, I'm just really fortunate in that the work I am doing is making a tangible impact in people's lives. So that has to make you smile. That has to make you feel like you're doing something meaningful. And even though some days are better than others with Charles Bonnet and Wolfram, overall, it's been a positive.
So right now, do you actually have Wolfram syndrome or do you have optic atrophy, or are they one and the same? I just want to make sure I understand you.
Yeah. So Wolfram syndrome is a rare form. Okay. Taking a step back, Wolfram syndrome is an endoplasmic stress reticulum disorder. The important thing there is it means the optic nerves for me are not as hardy as they should be. They're not, hardy, I think is the best way to explain it. So I have vision loss as a result of those optic nerves connecting the eyes to the brain being damaged, much like patients with glaucoma. I've had a lot more central vision loss than most. I for sure have the peripheral vision loss, but the optic atrophy is my visual manifestation of Wolfram syndrome, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for definitely explaining that. One thing I would like to know is you started experiencing symptoms of Charles Bonnet syndrome, and you explained some of those early experiences you've had. But when did you actually find out what Charles Bonnet syndrome was, and that was in fact what you had?
I honestly don't remember how I really learned about Charles Bonnet syndrome. I am confident I was on Google Scholar or reading JAMA or one of the American Academy of Ophthalmology publications where I came across this. And I started reading about not only the syndrome, but about Charles Bonnet, the actual man behind the syndrome. And first of all, his story is fascinating. This guy was a Swiss naturalist and scientist, and he had 1,000,001 different passions that he pursued. He was also a caregiver for his grandfather who was losing his vision. I forget what diagnosis he had, but grandpa was experiencing these visual manifestations, and this was something new. It was something that had not been described in the literature before. This is what became known as Charles Bonnet syndrome. Interestingly enough, Charles Bonnet also was severely visually impaired himself. But the more I learned about it and the more I learned about those two kinds of visual experiences, I'm almost hesitant to call them hallucinations. I don't particularly care about the terms. I know some people are sensitive about hallucination because it implies that what they are seeing is not real, but what you're seeing is very much real to us. Our brain is giving us that information. That's how it's being processed. But eventually I learned about the condition. And I remember I was seeing my glaucoma doctor on a quarterly basis. I was doing a lot of writing for a magazine called Glaucoma Today. I'm now the section editor of their patient perspective column that's coming out every 2 months. But they had given me an opportunity to write a recurring feature about the experience of patient vision loss going to the glaucoma clinic. At the time, a lot of it was about going to the eye doctor during the pandemic, which was weird as is. It was even weirder going blind during COVID. But I remember going to my doctor and she said, "Hey, anything new going on?" And I said, "Everything seems to be the same as far as the vision loss." At that point, I had bottomed out on a lot of the testing. We didn't do the OCT imaging of the optic nerves anymore because there was no value for me. But what I described to the doctor, I said, "Look, I am experiencing a lot of issues with visual processing." I told her about the dogs. I told her about the fence. I told her about the nose putty. I told her about curbs looking like ramps, steps looking like ramps, not being able to really accurately read someone's face. Just 3 nights ago, I was going for a walk with my wife and someone waved at us and she said, "Tell me what they look like." And I described what this woman was wearing. She was wearing a black jumpsuit. She had long dark hair. I think it was up in a bun. And she was wearing big sunglasses, big brown sunglasses. And my wife laughed and she pretty much said, none of those things were accurate. She's not wearing any sunglasses. But I told the doctor about it and I was sitting in the exam chair. She was in her little rolly chair. Her eyes got big as saucers. She rolled her chair over to me and she went, "Wow. I've only had 2 patients ever with Charles Bonnet syndrome." So she agreed with the self-diagnosis, but she proceeded to go on and tell me these patients were old and they were blind. They couldn't see, and I'll leave the obscenities out, but I looked at her and I did that thing where you take your index finger and your middle finger and you point at yourself and you point at the other person. And I said, "Yeah, that's what I'm experiencing." And she looked at me. She didn't really know what to say. Appointment ended. I went home. I got a note from Glaucoma Today. They said, "Hey, what do you want to write about for the next column?" So I wrote about Charles Bonnet. I came back 3 months later. That issue of Glaucoma Today was in the waiting room. Doctor runs me through the tests. She says, "What's going on? Anything new?" And I said, "I'm having more and more of these visual manifestations." As I look around my office right now, I don't think I'm seeing anything out of sorts, but I just don't know. It looks like a complete picture. But it was like Groundhog's Day. She did the same thing with the rolly chair, and I did the same thing where I pointed with my fingers. And I said, yeah, I've told you this already. And I told her about the column in that periodical that was sitting in her waiting room. I said, look, I wrote about you in our encounter. Obviously, you haven't read it yet. But what I'm really hoping you take away from this conversation is a lot of your patients, maybe a third of them, could be dealing with this. You need to be really careful about the way you're asking questions so you can hopefully create space for people to let you know what's going on. I know it's not malicious. It's not hurtful. I know you only have, 12 minutes with each patient. But if questions aren't being asked in such a way, patients aren't going to proactively tell you about Charles Bonnet syndrome, right? So let's work together to raise awareness and to educate, whether it's other ophthalmic professionals or other patients, about this condition. And what can I tell you? The third time we had that conversation was the time I said, look, I'm not coming back quarterly anymore. There's no point. The exams aren't changing the course of my vision loss. You're not doing anything for the Charles Bonnet. I'll come back yearly. And in fact, I think my 1-year follow-up is going to be in September. So it's been 8-9 months at this point since my last visit. But self-diagnosis confirmed by the doctor. I guess I probably read about it through the American Academy of Ophthalmology, or maybe it was one of these databases of rare conditions, even though we know Charles Bonnet is not rare, in fact.
And was this an ophthalmologist?
This was an ophthalmologist who is specially trained and focuses their time in patients with glaucoma.
Okay. All right. And to only have 2 patients. So I was thinking either some other patients had it and they just didn't feel comfortable telling her about it, or maybe that's what I'm thinking, but I can't just say that because I'm not her patient. So I don't really know for sure. Cause like you just said, it is actually not uncommon. It's actually pretty common once you start. And also too, like what you said, as you talk to people about it, and you're pretty much an advocate and you talk about the condition, you start seeing people react. And some people come up to you and say, hey, you know what? I was experiencing these things. So if the atmosphere was right, like if they had a sign in the doctor's office that said, Charles Bonnet, visual hallucinations, or whatever, however you want to put it up there, or some pamphlets, then people would say, or even like a video that's playing in case somebody has severe vision loss, they can't see that, they can hear it or something like that. Then you never know. It could be more people that say, you know what, I've experienced it, because Charles Bonnet can be very like serious is what I'm going to say, for lack of better words, where it can be quite frightening, and it could be vivid visual hallucinations, or it could be something like a pattern or light. So that's more on the mild side, but that's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, you can't be sure. I can't be sure. I'm not much of a gambler, but if I had to put money on it, I think the odds would be in our favor, because we know, again, it's something like 1/3 to 40% of people experiencing moderate to severe vision loss probably have Charles Bonnet. So if she's only heard about 2 in 15 years, patients just haven't been comfortable bringing it up. But certainly there are other patients like me in that clinic.
Can you discuss whatever you're comfortable sharing, whatever comes to your mind, about clinical trials and the process of finding drug treatments for conditions or having studies? Because I assume that's pretty much what you're involved in. First of all, is that correct? Am I understanding that correctly? And then if you can discuss whatever you can shed about any information you can share about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm co-founder and chief operating officer of a company called Canary Advisors. And we work to make sure that when people are developing new treatments, or maybe the first treatments, if you have a condition that's an orphan disease that doesn't have a treatment, that they are incorporating the patient and or caregiver perspective in what they're doing. So I am no longer involved in finding clinical trial sites or identifying patients who might qualify and be interested in a clinical trial. I'm helping to make sure the clinical trial designs are relevant to what patients actually care about. I work to identify burdens and barriers to trials, things of that nature. I also make sure that when there is an exciting new treatment being developed or perhaps already approved, that access and reimbursement aren't sources of delay, right? So patients can actually get access to that treatment that might make a world of difference for them. But I spend a lot of time talking to friends and family, neighbors, strangers about clinical research because in a lot of ways it is mysterious and unknown to the general public. I think with the development of some of the COVID vaccines, some people probably learned about clinical research for the first time. But I spend a lot of my time educating and building awareness of clinical research as a care option. And the idea is there can't be a new treatment for glaucoma or Stargardt's disease or anything else without clinical trials. You can't have a successful clinical trial without patients. And when I say successful, I'm really meaning a clinical trial where enough patients have been enrolled, where it's possible to get the requisite amount of data that needs to be analyzed, right? If the data is promising, fantastic. If it's not, fantastic. Companies can spend their time and their resources on something else. But one of my major goals is to make sure that once patients or anyone can be a patient, right? Once people are aware of clinical research as a care option, that those considering research, number one, know how to find a trial, and two, know how to make an informed and educated decision about whether clinical trial participation is right for them. So right now, the gold standard for how to find a clinical trial is clinicaltrials.gov. It's a government-run website. It is less than ideal, but it's the best we have. There are all sorts of services that do things called trial matching. So you can go to a website, antidote.me, and you can answer 6 or 8 questions based on you, your diagnosis, your zip code, where you live, how far you'd be willing to travel for a clinical trial. Maybe you only want to participate remotely from home. You can answer that as well. But you would get a curated list of clinical trial opportunities that are relevant to your interests. But the problem really is awareness, both for patients as well as clinicians. Because I think it's about 1/5 of 1% of the time a clinician, a doctor, a nurse practitioner could be having these conversations about clinical research with patients. That's how often they're actually having them, because the vast majority of clinicians aren't involved in clinical research. They don't know about clinical trials. We don't talk about it in med school. We don't raise a lot of awareness about ways to say, refer patients to clinical trials, right? Maybe you have a patient who is just not doing well on the standard of care. They need something above and beyond that. Maybe there's a clinical trial in the community, right? Where you can refer the patient out. They can make that educated and informed decision for themselves. And you as a clinician can really help them get the care that they really need. So I spend time sort of dispelling a lot of the inaccuracies about clinical research, right? We're not experimenting on people. People aren't guinea pigs, right? We talk about clinical research protections and the institutional review boards, who are in many ways the unsung heroes of clinical research. These are groups of individuals. Some of them are professional companies that review clinical research full time. That's all they do. But others are comprised of community members, right? It could be the single mom down the block. It could be the janitor at the medical school that's running this trial. They are tasked with getting a number of questions addressed so they feel comfortable about having a particular clinical trial in their community. And if they're not comfortable, it doesn't get approved. But they are laser focused on keeping patients safe and then making sure that the information being shared with these potential clinical research participants is free of undue influence. It's not going to coerce someone. You're not going to advertise clinical trial where you have to get 1,000 injections, but good news, we'll pay you $1,000, right? Because $1,000 is a lot of money. And a lot of people would say, I don't care how many injections I have to get for $1,000. If I need that money, I need that money. So making sure the information is there, the information is patient friendly, it is impactful, it's understandable, and the end result is that patients can make those informed and educated decisions. So I build awareness of clinical research. I talk to doctors as well as just my friends, my neighbors, my community members, so they know that new therapies, new treatments aren't possible without clinical trials, and clinical trials aren't possible without them. They really are the VIPs here.
I know this is a loaded question, and I hate to put you on the spot, but I'm just curious, what are some thoughts or ideas that you have that can help us get more research for Charles Bonnet Syndrome and maybe more treatments or some kind of potential drugs or something? Do you have any insight into that or thoughts?
Yeah, I've got a couple thoughts. A lot of the work I do is around what they call patient-focused drug development. This is a framework the US FDA rolled out 2012, I think. It's a structured and systematic way where we can learn about those unmet needs, those quality of life impacts, those patient preferences. There have been a couple what they call externally led patient-focused drug development meetings in ophthalmology, but really the only handful. The FDA also hosts what they call patient listening sessions. These are much smaller, shorter opportunities to learn about those unmet needs, quality of life impacts, and preferences. I'm not certain, but I would guess that Charles Bonnet has not been discussed in any of these other meetings. I don't know that there necessarily has to be a meeting specific to Charles Bonnet, but I think if any of these organizations, any of these nonprofits that are running these externally led patient-focused drug development meetings, if they have the opportunity, if they survey their communities to learn about what's really most impactful in their lives, if they start asking about Charles Bonnet, they'll probably learn that a number of community members are dealing with it and they're not satisfied with some of the options they have to deal with Charles Bonnet syndrome. And they might find that age-related macular degeneration is pretty rough. The treatment options are not ideal, but there's also a complementary quality of life impact here, in addition to vision loss, Charles Bonnet syndrome, which needs to be addressed as well. So it could be as simple as providing some educational materials during the course of a clinical trial, right, about Charles Bonnet syndrome, just as a, look, I know you're a patient with vision loss. It doesn't matter the diagnosis, but here's something we want you to know about. There could be opportunities for some of these nonprofits to maybe partner with some of these drug development firms and some of these companies that might have a vested interest in educating the community, speaking with the community, and also, a more substantial budget than the nonprofits might have to raise awareness, to educate, to inform about Charles Bonnet syndrome. It's the same kind of approach I think about when I think about educating people about glaucoma. They call glaucoma the sneak thief of sight because the vast majority of patients don't even know they have it. There are no signs or symptoms. They don't find out they have glaucoma until often they've lost about 40% of their vision. 40% vision loss is substantial enough where there's a decent chance they're dealing with Charles Bonnet as well. So the public health person in me always comes back to education and awareness and just creating space to have these conversations amongst patients as well as clinicians to let people know that Charles Bonnet is very real. It's very common. There's some things that can be done. And it's very infrequently talked about. We tend to focus on the forms of vision loss, not necessarily some of the downstream consequences or implications like Charles Bonnet.
I'm thinking about what you said about glaucoma and how a lot of people don't realize it until they've had maybe 40% of their vision loss. And that reminds me that it's so important to get your eyes checked every single year, because I think glaucoma, obviously an ophthalmologist can diagnose it and look further into it. But I believe an optometrist can even find that, because I think they do pressure checks at your local eye care centers.
That is correct. And I'm off camera here, but I'm smiling ear to ear because one of the things I'm really interested in, and I'm fortunate in that I get to do this work with the brilliant team, the Glaucoma Research Foundation, is how do we, number one, build awareness of glaucoma? How do we, number two, build awareness of the fantastic work being done for vision restoration, to educate the community impacted by glaucoma, to let patients know that it is possible to have this condition without knowing it, right? But we spend a lot of time thinking, how can we work upstream? Could be with optometrists. It could be with primary care doctors. It could be working with federally qualified health centers, could be talking to med students, right? But how do we catch this condition before it progresses to vision loss? Because right now, when you've lost vision, you've lost vision. It is not something you can reverse. Although, again, Glaucoma Research Foundation is funding some fantastic scientific endeavors through their Catalyst for a Cure group right now that will hopefully pay off for vision restoration work, irrespective of how you've lost that eyesight. But yeah, I think there's a lot that can be done with optometrists. There's information that can be maybe provided for their practice, whether it's things like understanding and living with glaucoma, which is a great resource available in a couple different languages, and an audio version from the Glaucoma Research Foundation. Maybe Esme's Umbrella has some fantastic Charles Bonnet Syndrome educational material that could be shared as well. I know there's a cost for all of this stuff, and printing patient-facing materials isn't cheap, but it would be fantastic. It would be an absolute dream. You could go to Lens Crafters, your community optometrist, and have all of these fantastic leaflets or whatever type of patient-facing information it is to build awareness about not only the silent sneak thief of sight, but also maybe Charles Bonnet Syndrome and other conditions here that impact the vision loss community.
That sounds great. And I'm sure people will definitely take heed to that and do that. And people are already doing that. Like you said, Esme's Umbrella, the CNIB in Canada. We also have Eva Potts here in the States. She's forming Mary Carmel's Light, and it's primarily focused on CBS. But we know CBS affects people that have vision loss. So she's has resources and working with doctors to spread awareness and try to do a lot of things. One question that I have that I would like to ask you is, what are some things that you do to cope with Charles Bonnet Syndrome?
I love that question. Thank you so much for asking. I mentioned laughter is one. Believe it or not, even though I am substantially visually impaired, I'm a big runner. I don't run as fast as I used to. I don't do a lot of roads I'm unfamiliar with anymore. And I wear a reflective vest that says blind front and back. But I was just out there yesterday. I went for a run with my wife. And I went for a run with a new friend who found me through a group called United in Stride. They pair visually impaired athletes, in particular runners, with running guides. So these are individuals, it could just be your friend, your neighbor, someone down the street, right? Who says, look, I like to run. Maybe I like to ride a bike. I'd be interested in helping those with vision loss, vision impairments, run or ride more safely. I want to become a guide. So I was chatting with a potential running guide yesterday, talking about Charles Bonnet Syndrome, talking about Wolfram and vision loss. But I spend a lot of time running for sure. And the last one I'll say there, I spend a lot of time walking. And like many people with vision loss, I got to the point where a white cane crossed my mind. And I wouldn't say I had a mental block, but I kept waiting for the time to be quote unquote right to get my first white cane. And I started doing research online. I started watching YouTube videos from orientation and mobility specialists, the people who train you how to use a white cane, how to pour coffee, how to cut onions when you're visually impaired. And I learned about the types of canes. I learned about the most popular techniques for using a cane. I decided I was going to get one. This was last winter, so winter 2023. And I finally ordered the cane. I spent a couple days walking around the house and then a couple more walking around the neighborhood as though I had a cane in my hand. I decided I was going to use the cane with the constant contact method, where you go between 10 and 2, like where your hands are on a steering wheel, and you just go back and forth. If your left foot is going forward, cane goes to the right, right foot goes forward, cane goes to the left, and it provides tactile information for you about your surroundings. And I decided to do that because I mentioned depth perception is a challenge. I spend a lot of time talking to people with vision loss who are not necessarily confident or comfortable with the idea of using a white cane. And I think I've had 3 of those conversations recently. And I would say, look, if you are even thinking about whether a cane is right for you? Yes, it is. If you have trouble with vision loss, this can help. If you're concerned about being able to navigate safely and independently, yep, you're an excellent candidate. One of the things that's been really interesting for me, I mentioned I run a lot. I wear that reflective vest that says blind front and back. I don't know what it is. I'm confident it's not people trying to be nasty, but I find whether pedestrians, bicyclists, motorists, they almost veer towards me wearing that vest. I think they just can't process, how is this blind guy able to go for a run? But the reaction I get when I use a white cane is completely different. People give me space. I have more room to work. People aren't any more or less friendly. But I think the benefit of giving people that visual cue, because one of the things I've learned throughout the last 4 or 5 years here dealing with vision loss is a spectrum. Blindness is a spectrum. I think it's less than 2% of visually impaired use a cane. Less than 10% of us learn Braille. I have some dear friends who are substantially more visually impaired than I am. Some of them can only see emotion and light, but they are award-winning Paralympic athletes, right? I don't know what people think blind looks like, but I am not it, right? So using that cane is a good opportunity to, again, educate and build awareness there. And the last thing I'll say about the cane and walking and using it to process and blow off steam. I was in a hotel a couple months ago. I was by myself. I was quite honestly probably walking around the floor testing my Braille skills, which are not very good, but I've done a decent job learning numbers and letters. And you'll find Braille is always on elevators. It's always on room numbers at hotels, even though you can't necessarily figure out where the room number is if you're visually impaired. But I was walking down towards the elevator. I was using my white cane, and a guy working in housekeeping said, "Excuse me, sir." And he seemed nervous, and I didn't know what he was going to ask. But I said, "Yeah, what's going on?" And he said, "Can I ask you a question about your stick?" A lot of people refer to a white cane as a stick. And I said, "Sure, absolutely." And he proceeded to tell me that he had seen 4 or 5 people over the past couple weeks with white canes, and he noticed that there are different colors and different numbers of segments and different tips on the cane and all these different things. And we started talking. He said, the cane I was using it was mostly white, but it has a red segment, and the red segment is the one you get by default, which is supposed to be telling people that you have some vision. This guy wouldn't have known if he didn't ask me. I wouldn't have known if I hadn't looked into it. But we started talking about white canes and the different kinds of tips you might have on your cane, the different colors, the different techniques. And it was a really good conversation. The guy was lovely. I think we each thanked each other for the time and the opportunity to just chat and learn more and just have that dialogue. So I'm certainly not suggesting that everyone has to be an advocate or you always have to spend time educating and sometimes correcting people when they're being dumb. Sometimes people just say really dumb things to you. You can't be blind. What are you using that thing for? Why are you wearing sunglasses inside? And sometimes they don't mean anything by it. Sometimes they're just being rude. Advocating and educating, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of bandwidth. You certainly don't have to feel like you need to do it. You certainly don't have to feel like you have to do it all the time. You have to really be protective of your own energy and your own well-being. I don't know that I'll welcome all these conversations every day for all time, but I'll just say, again, as a public health person, I'm used to educating and building awareness. If I feel like I can do more good than harm having those conversations, I'm here for it. You learn something new every time you meet interesting people. So I guess that's the last thing I would say I do to cope is just have conversations, talk to people about vision loss. I don't know how it was when you were in school, but I know when I was in school, they often had separate classrooms for kids that had, whether it was visual impairment, mobility issues, and they called it special education. And I think most of the time it was doing everybody a disservice, right? Because you don't get to really learn as a kid that everybody is different. We're probably more similar than dissimilar. And there's some really cool things you can learn from people who are different from you. Some of my best friends have spinal muscular atrophy, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, all sorts of other things that seem on their face to be so different from what I'm dealing with every day. But the more you learn how similar these conditions are. The last thing I will say here, and I've got to give a shameless plug. I am so fortunate. I am on the board of an organization called One Rare. We educate and empower, and we serve the community, young adults 18 to 35 impacted by rare disease. We are getting ready for another one of our yearly in-person events in July, a One Rare experience. But just talking with young adults who are either speakers at the event, attendees, often they're both, you get to learn about all of these different conditions. And ultimately, I think I said this at the very top of our call, you learn that no matter how these conditions differ, there is so much commonality in all of them. So it's just another opportunity to make connections and to have some experiences that maybe you wouldn't have had otherwise. Definitely looking forward to that event, and definitely it's been a wonderful learning experience.
This is great. I've learned so much. You do so many great things, and you're definitely passionate about what you do. And I appreciate all the things that you're doing, and you're definitely making a difference. So how can people find you or connect with you? Do you want to share your website of your company or email?
Yeah, absolutely. People can get a hold of me. They can go to the website. It's Canary, like the bird, Advisors, LLC, LarryCharles.com. My contact information's on there. I'm active on LinkedIn. And if you just Google Richie Kahn, RICHIEKAHN, glaucoma or Charles Bonnet, you'll find a bunch of different ways to get a hold of me. I always welcome the conversation, and looking forward to connecting with some of the listeners. Thank you for everything you're doing. Thank you for this podcast. I think it's much needed. And thank you again for the opportunity to be part of it.